and welcome to the presentation on flame retardants. I'm Rahul Kulkarni, and thank you so much for joining me. And this is for Global Environmental Health Section 2. So what are flame retardants? Well, it's really a functional term. It just basically is the name or classification for a chemical that slows the burning process. And it's used, as the picture shows, in couches, on electronic devices, carpeting, and other paraphernalia that you would find in your apartment. Now, there are 5 main types of FRs, and we will get into every one of these specifically and what health hazards they pose. Global consumption per region of FRs really comes from North America as well as Western Europe, totally about 44% of the total consumption in the entire world. And what are the leading chemicals after aluminum hydroxide, which is posed at 41% in the global consumption per chemical type, is led by organophosphorus compounds or organophosphates, or brominated flammable retardants or flame retardants. And we will get into specifics of these in subsequent slides. Also of note, we see is antimony oxide, which will also be covered down the line. But one may ask, why do we have so many different types of flame retardants? Well, one possible answer is of synergy. These chemicals interact with each other and enhance each other's effects because of their presence in a mixture. For example, antimony trioxide, which we covered in previous slides, can be combined in any proportion in any sort of mixture with any of the above 5 compounds that we measured: brominated flame retardants, chlorinated flame retardants, etc. ATOs, or antimony trioxide, are inert by themselves and can only function with other flammable retardants, and that is also true for other metallic oxides, which are also used as flammable retardants, namely magnesium, aluminum, etc. Also, other chemicals to note that we did not cover in the previous graphs were about aluminum trihydrate. So for the valuation of flammable retardants, the business, as it were, of flammable retardants and what businesses it is used, it was evaluated at close to $7.2 billion, billion dollars in 2023, and previously in 2021 it was at 6.72, and because of a 5.1% of compounded annual growth, this figure of market valuation is supposed to reach somewhere around $10.2 billion until 2030. Graph here shows much of the business that has actually been driven by electronic industries, furniture industries, which are usually the ones who use some of the worst offenders of flammable retardants. Antimony trioxide, as we mentioned, aluminum trihydrate, or any of the brominated or chlorinated flammable retardants as we know it. But why should we care about flammable retardants? Well, going back to our 5 classifications, each one of them actually pose a significant risk to health. When we speak about brominated flammable retardants, for example, that implicated in endocrine, thyroid dysfunctions, and I would like to point attention to this word lipophilic, which essentially means that these chemicals, for example, BFRs, they are soluble and are, instead of saying soluble, I'll say they're easily mixed with fat molecules. And why is this important from a biological perspective? It's because on a biological unit, the cell, the coating of it is actually covered by a hydrophobic or a lipophilic layer, bilayer, which serves as a barrier between the inside of the cell versus the outside of the cell. So it's like a protection layer. These chemicals, by virtue of being lipophilic, can bypass the protective barrier and therefore cause intracellular toxicity. And one of the biggest risks that these chemicals pose is towards neurodevelopmental disorders, which is also something that is mentioned. For example, polybrominated diphenyl ethers. These are also lipophilic. But the thing about neurodevelopmental disorders is actually key because your brain is protected by something called as the triple B barrier, or the blood-brain barrier. And if any molecule, for that matter, is lipophilic, that means fat soluble, that molecule is easily able to bypass the cellular protection inside your system, and therefore cause local or systemic toxicity. I would also like us to focus on tetrabromobisphenol A, which is actually classified as a carcinogen. And we will talk about regulation in terms of banning, in terms of manufacturer, retail regulation, business regulation, etc. down the line. But of note, TBPA has been classified as a carcinogen and banned in California. And it is of note that, in fact, businesses who are found to be using TBPA constantly and not complying with relevant laws and regulations can actually be fined by the Attorney General of the state itself. Lastly, in this, I would like to point out a firefighter study, not included over here, but I would like to point out that there was a study that was conducted by the American Chemical Society in the Environmental Science and Technology Journal that focused on comparison, longitudinal comparison, or for that matter, case comparison between firefighters as well as regular office workers, the desk workers as we have it, and really compared concentrations of these flammable retardants, different kinds. I mean, these five kinds of flammable retardants are really just the surface. You can, because of chemical modification, have some classifications under each and every one of them. So really the sky is the limit in terms of how many chemicals you can actually get out of them. So firefighter study and the office control study looked at flammable retardants in blood serum, also measured hormone levels of thyroxine hormone on urine analysis, finding that firefighters in fact have a higher exposure or higher blood serum levels of flammable retardants, and also have a low thyroid hormone circulation, which was documented by urine analysis. Now, the reason why this is important is because thyroid hormone is really important for basic metabolic functionalities that's required for bone health. And now, if you have dysregulation of this endocrine organ, you can think about premature incidences of osteoporosis. It's not really documented in the literature that I reviewed so far, but that's a reasonable suspicion to have down the line, and maybe potential research avenue that one can pursue. Also, women are at increased risk for thyroid hormone dysfunctions because it really matters in terms of perimenopausal, postmenopausal, and premenopausal stages, and what kind of other reproductive abnormalities that they might actually have, and how this could play into that. So really, it's when it comes down to drawing the mechanisms between how these different factors interact with each other, there's increasing complexity as far as that is concerned. So let's talk about regulation. Well, in 1970s, what really happened was California essentially allowed businesses to use flammable retardants in their furnishings and their products and distribute it and sell it widely to the public, which led to an increased prevalence of flammable retardants during the 1970s. And over the next couple of years, took a decade or two, people started realizing that children, for example, were getting more and more exposed to this. The reason being that there was increased hand-to-mouth behavior that is very common among infants and toddlers. There are increased risk. Children don't necessarily have an understanding of what is edible and what's not, and they just put anything inside their mouth, and therefore are exposed to these chemicals. So in 2000, somewhere around there, states started adopting and started formalizing regulations and enacting laws which controlled the prevalence of these substances. And really, the bans on flammable retardants really started coming out in the mid 2000s. The production of flammable retardants itself phased out in 2004, but the state regulation in terms of outright banning of these kind of chemicals did not take place until after. So we'll get down more into that. So this gives like a lay of the land terrain of how many states have actually had current policies that were present in the early 2000s. New York was one of the leading states, as we see, with 5 policy regulations directly hammering at flammable retardant regulation. But of note, none of these states ever enacted an outright ban policy against flammable retardants. People were still just regulating, they were just requiring labeling, they were still requiring other forms of regulations, capping, for example, but there was no ban as such, but we will get more into that. Now, up until 2021, the banning process of flammable retardants actually started in the mid 2000s, but up until 2021, even the states, for example, California, who already had regulations in terms of flammable retardants, in fact, doubled down on their regulations and enforced stricter rules and give increased deference in terms of regulatory authority to fire marshals. Local governance was very important, not just state, to really enact regulations and actually inform state legislature in terms of forming new regulations. And in fact, the cap was made at a 1,000 part per million, which could not be exceeded at any cost. And if any business were found in violation of this clause, could be charged up to $2,500 per day of violation per violation itself. So if from a business perspective, that money really adds up. And this essentially in California became a problem, not just for the state, but also for the Attorney General's office. So an AG can come down on a business itself if they wish to, and they can also interact with our neighboring attorney generals in regulating these chemicals as well, because you can also have interstate commerce production happening in one place, which may or may not be compliant with flammable retardant regulations, bringing in and selling the products within the state that actually has these regulations. So that really shifted gears as far as legal and regulatory terrain goes. Of note also is Maine. Maine was really interesting because it was also the only state that I found that also had executive orders from the Oval Office in support of its phase-out plans between the years 2004 to 2007. And so that could also be a potential policy intervention plan where the president comes in and takes active interest in controlling of public health and environmental toxins, in this case, flammable retardants. And this just gives a model conceptual breakdown of how flammable retardants are typically regulated in the United States. So the Environmental Protection Agency is given specific authority under the Toxic Substances Control Act, which was enacted in 1976, and allows EPA to require labeling, require reporting, require basic regulatory compliances as far as business is concerned, and the use of flammable retardants overall. This does not just focus on businesses, but it also focuses on the environment at large. Anyone can simply go in and file a complaint with the EPA in terms of any business practices, but really the bread and butter of handling private business is really Consumer Product Safety Commission, which is CPSC. CPSC is given authority under the Federal Hazardous Substances Act, which was initially enacted in the 1960s, but also was amended in 1966 because of our Child Protections Act, which was also covering children who were being exposed to some of these chemicals. And together, when the CPSC under the FHSA controls for consumer product safety, this inevitably spills over to regulation of flammable retardants, as is mentioned as is denoted in the arrow that goes from consumer product safety to flammable retardants. So future directions of FRs can focus on private business leadership. Best Buy, as I understand, has already made an announcement in terms of FR restrictions. And this is somewhat of the self-regulatory behavior of private businesses and agencies to really prevent government interventions coming in and regulating their operation. So this is something that should be encouraged more on a local level. Flammable retardants, because of their functional properties, are also used for building safety codes. And this is where I think local governance can come into picture, where local fire departments, local fire marshals who actually go day in and day out in terms of responding to some of these fire incidences can recommend regulatory substitutes to flammable retardants and help in the phase out process more locally speaking, and really working with the city as well as the state legislatures. Enhanced state-directed oversight. We did see that a lot of states adopted policies to give more regulatory ceiling. We saw this in the example of Maine particularly. And we also need federal agency action in terms of CPSC, in terms of the executive order that we saw in case of Maine that had that support. But despite all of that, there still seems to be some kind of leak in terms of regulation, and the holes where it needs to be plugged. Because the commission, the CPSC, is not required for products that contain organic flammable retardants to have precautionary label in their products. That is still not the case. And there's a guidance document that is actually released by the CPSC and a part of the Federal Register, which actually does not state out exact requirements in terms of businesses, and really leaves it to individual private businesses to make their own regulations so far as they meet a particular standard. So this is where I think federal agency can enhance their actions a little more and try to really target their aim and curb flammable retardant prevalence in their population more long term, and in that way also regulate other hazardous substances. So thank you so much for your time. If you have any burning questions regarding this presentation, any thoughts, concerns, comments, please feel free to reach out to me at the given email or arcade972 at nyu.edu. And thank you so much for joining me.